Welcome to Podcast Essentials, the mechanics of podcasting. This is another in our ongoing series of live presentations on the art and mechanics of podcasting, or the art and the science of podcasting even. So today we're going to talk about how your audio file gets from your laptop. How you create that audio file will be the subject of a different presentation. But today we're talking about how that file becomes a podcast, how it moves from your laptop to your listeners' ears. The important thing to remember is that there are 4 steps involved, four people involved, 4 organisations, entities, 4 entities involved. There's yourself with your file, there's your host who looks after and stores your files, there's iTunes or other aggregators, and then there's your listeners. Now, I'll be talking about iTunes because most of the aggregators scrape from iTunes anyway. There are some people that have separate libraries, but iTunes covers most of the podcast universe, mostly because Apple invented it. So what happens is we upload our file to our host. Now, a host is where you store your audio files. iTunes does not store audio files. We'll come to that in a minute. Your host does. Now, there are any number of free hosting options out there, and with free hosting options, you get exactly what you pay for. Probably the best of them is archive.org. That's a list of everything on the internet, basically. So you can store your files there, but really, because they're a non-profit, you need to slip them a few bob now and then just to cover their costs. Other free hosting options would be SoundCloud, where you can have up to 180 minutes of audio. The trouble with SoundCloud is that it's designed for music. Like a lot of things we use in podcasting, they were originally designed for musicians. So things like audio editors, in particular something like GarageBand, which I use, it has got so many options for musicians that we really don't need as podcasters. And this is the GO with SoundCloud as well. They're not designed for podcasters. So when you've uploaded your file to them, the options for spreading the word and getting the file out are much more limited. But it's a good place to start if you wanted to just test the waters. I did my first 10, 15 episodes on SoundCloud before moving to my current host, which I'll get to in a minute. And the thing with SoundCloud is that they had financial issues at the end of last year and may only have funding till the end of this year. And because it costs money to host, if you're using a free service, the money's got to come from somewhere, and it's either your files are used, as in what happens with Anchor, or you pay a small amount each month for the hosting, and that way you know it's going to be around. Now, I use Libsyn, and Libsyn's been around since 2004, I believe, and they're the largest host. And they have many options so that not only can I send my audio file through Libsyn to iTunes, it can also go direct as a video to Facebook and YouTube, and it's also available on Spotify. Spotify is interesting because it's an Android system. Well, there's more people on Android use Spotify than use any other podcatcher. And Spotify is not a particular podcatcher. It is for music, but it's a way for people to discover podcasts anyway. And I'm not getting a lot of downloads there, but I am getting some. And these are downloads I wouldn't have got otherwise. Podbean's another one you can use, but I prefer Libsyn because of all the, one, the data, and 2, the destinations. So not only do I send it to Spotify and YouTube, where else? Facebook Live, send it out to my blog. It also goes to Twitter, so that once an episode's released, a lot more people have ways of accessing it. Excuse me. Now then, you've got your file up to your host and it's sitting there quietly. And how are your listeners going to know you've got a new episode out? Well, there's a thing called an RSS feed. sometimes referred to as really simple syndication, but it's actually a rich site summary is the correct meaning of those three letters, RSS. Now, a good host will provide you with an RSS feed. Even the less good ones do. You get one with SoundCloud. And what happens is after you've got one episode up on your host, you then go to iTunes. And because iTunes covers 80-90% of the market, you really need to be in there. So you sign in with your Apple ID, you put in your RSS feed, and then Apple goes and checks your host to make sure that your artwork's legit. There's no, what's the word? There's no profanity if you've ticked it as a clean feed, as a clean episode or suitable for children or whatever. And literally they have people who listen to the first episode, or at least one episode. And you have to have at least one before you can go to iTunes. So normally we start off with a trailer episode when we're beginning a new podcast, maybe 2 minutes long, saying, hi, here I am, this is what I'm going to be about. The artwork has to be between, I think it's 1400 by 1400 pixels up to 3000 by 3000. And that's stored again, along with your audio files, on your host. Now, every time you upload a new episode, your RSS feed updates automatically. Back in the old days, when podcasting first started, people had to handcraft their RSS feeds. And there was a lot of coding involved. And as a consequence, a lot of broken feeds. The system's now been around for so long that it can be automated. And so I never bother even looking at the feed except when I'm teaching students to show them what it is and why they shouldn't touch it. So the RSS feed updates, Apple pings your host because you've recorded that your host, whom your host is when you loaded it on iTunes through Podcast Connect. And Podcast Connect is another session we'll be doing later in the series. But for the moment, let's assume that you've been accepted by iTunes, you've got your first episode up, and then it's available in iTunes and on the Apple Podcast app and all the other apps and podcatchers you've got out there. So having sent out the trailer, you then do episode 1. Episode 1 gets loaded up from your laptop into your host. There's details for show notes and all that sort of thing. There's lots of Apple tags you can fill in on Libsyn that you can't do on SoundCloud, which makes Apple happier. And because Apple's the 10,000-pound gorilla in the room, you need to keep Apple happy. Apple then sees that your RSS feed has changed because I don't know how often they ping it, but it's almost instantaneous. And I've been joined by my co-host from time to time, young Mr. Bowden. Okay.
Young Mr. Moore, how are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. We've just moved the audio file. We've done our trailer episode. Mm-hmm. We've recorded ourselves as being a podcaster with iTunes, and I'm now explaining what happens with the next episode 1. And then,
John, could I just get you to quickly summarise that iTunes bit again? It's something I struggle with.
Okay, so
just in a minute. Sorry.
Yeah, you're right. So iTunes is a library, basically, a library of RSS feeds. And as I was saying earlier, Podcast Connect is a separate session I'll be doing later in the series.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, through that process, we add our RSS feed and our artwork to Apple. Apple has a look, make sure that the RSS feed is legit, that there's no, that what we say we're doing. So if we say it's a clean show, they listen to the trailer and the whatever episodes are there and decide whether or not it's correct. If it's not, they won't register it in their library. So we're up to that. We've got our trailer there. Apple knows we exist. We send out our first episode. First episode goes to our host. Our host automatically updates our RSS feed. Apple pings our host quite frequently. I have no idea how often, but it seems to happen instantaneously. Realizes there's a new episode, loads it into iTunes, and sends this information to people's podcatchers. In my case, the Apple Podcast app.
Mm-hmm.
So that, which is why we all need to subscribe to our own shows to make sure that when we upload a new one, it shows up in a podcatcher And if it doesn't, then we can go hunting for problems with the feed or whatever.
Good point.
So it's gone from our laptop to our host. Apple spotted the difference in the host through the RSS feed, pings out to all the people that are using their podcatcher that there's a new episode, and then our listeners can access it. And they do not access it through iTunes. They draw directly on our host, which is why our hosts are able to give us statistics about how many times it's been downloaded and who's listening and where, depending on how much you want to spend on stats. And basically that's the system, and it goes on every time you add a new episode. Your host updates your RSS feed. Apple goes, there's a new one, lets people know, and then people can download from the host. Apple doesn't contain iTunes or Apple Podcasts doesn't hold any files at all. They just hold the RSS feed. And provided the RSS feed's working, you don't have to do anything with it. If it doesn't work, with some hosts, with Libsyn in particular, when you're filling out the show description, there's a little button you can hit to test the feed to see if what you've added's broken it. I remember one occasion someone added a photo to that RSS feed in the details, and that broke our feed, but by removing the photo and then rescanning, the feed was corrected.
Deliberate mistake, I think it was, John.
Yeah, I won't mention any names. But the thing is, it is fixable, and you can trace it down if you've got the right host. If that had happened on SoundCloud, I'd have had no idea what the problem was. Because you get an error message with I find with Libsyn, I get an error message to say the feed's broken on this line, and it'll take you to the line so you can fix it. It's
simple as that.
Yeah. It's not the bad old days of 2004-5, and the system works. And once you get into your head that the files aren't got anything to do with Apple, it's just an RSS feed and it's just a library of RSS feeds. You don't have to worry too much about what's going on there. And so go on.
Sorry, John. I was just going to say other podcatchers, like Pocket Cast, the one I use, they access their RSS feeds from Apple Music. Is that right?
Yeah, most of them. Well, from the iTunes or Apple Podcasts, as Apple prefers it to be called.
Yep.
But yeah, so like I was saying earlier, most of the podcatchers just scrape from iTunes anyway. There are some that don't, like I can't think of any off the top of my head, but why would you bother? Most of the podcasts, 99% of them at least, are with iTunes, and they invented the thing, so they keep an eye on it, and they set the standards, and the standards seem to work. If you are, as an aside, if you are going to use explicit language, it does mean you're banned from iTunes India. That's just one of their standards, that they don't have any explicit content on their particular page. So you're missing out on a potential billion listeners there if you wanted to go that way. But again, it's niches. It's all about niches. So to make it as simple as possible, I'll just refresh it all, because this can take a little while for some people to connect with, and other people just seem to get it straight away. So we have an audio file on our laptop. We upload it to our host. As we do that and publish it, our host recognizes that there's a new episode and changes the RSS feed. Apple spots the change in the RSS feed and tells the people who have their podcatcher there's a new episode. The listener then draws the audio file, downloads it from our host, not from Apple.
Okay.
So the point of contact where we can publicise that there's new episodes out, we can either point people to the iTunes page, because there's a list there of our shows, but not the files. And even if people download from there, they're actually downloading from our host, even if they've clicked download on the iTunes page, which is where I think some of the confusion comes from. So we use social media to drive people either to iTunes or perhaps to our website, where we'll always have a little player on one of the pages, probably every page, with our latest episode. or directly to our host where they can download from there and subscribe. So it's a 4-part system, and it's extraordinarily robust. So that's the way it is. There are people that don't want to call it podcasts and don't want to use Apple, but it's the beast in the room, so it's probably best to go with it. Now, to register your first your trailer episode with Apple, you will need an Apple ID, but you'll probably only need to use it once if you're vehemently anti-Apple. And I know there are people out there for some reason, but just suck it up, because that's what podcasting is, really. Does that make sense, Mr. B?
It does, and I suppose, all right, if you are anti-Apple, then you do have to go through the problem of registering your podcast with a whole lot of other podcatchers that wouldn't have the same ranges as Apple. As you discussed earlier, John, like, most of the podcatchers just take their RSS feeds from iTunes anyway. So, you're making it difficult for yourself, I think.
You're also cutting out huge amounts of potential listeners. So, it's, if you have a philosophical problem with it, well, I'm sorry, maybe you should be on YouTube or something instead. But it works, and anyway, it is what it is. So there's nothing we can do about it. So this is that's basically it for the mechanics. If anyone's got any questions, they can email me, John at mrjohnmoore.com. We go into more detail on. We've got there'll be a blog post up later tonight with a photo on it, so people can have a look at that, because sometimes visually it makes more sense. And there'll be an article with it as well. And we cover it, of course, in much more detail in the course. If you're interested in doing that, again at mrjohnmoore.com. So any other questions, just leave them in the comments down below. I think I'm supposed to do this. Yeah. Or if you're listening to this on the podcast, just email me.
Looked like something out of Monty Python for a minute there.
The joys of live work. Yeah. I think this is about our 4th or 5th one. I'm actually starting to feel comfortable with it. Which is like what happens when we start podcasting. We're more worried about the tech than the content. Although the content's still important from the beginning, but the tech's on the back of the mind. Yeah, and go on.
Just one thing, John. I presume you covered it earlier on, but I know you're a Libsyn man. Why is that? Why do you recommend Libsyn over any of the others?
Well, Libsyn's been around for quite a while, 2004, since the beginning of podcasting, and they're continually doing useful deals with people to get the content out further. So
Spotify.
Late last year I was able to put all our stuff up onto Spotify as well. I mean, it's not a huge market yet, but I'm getting double-digit downloads, especially for World Organic News, and I'm happy with that. And it's another way it's the easiest way for Android users to access podcasts that I've been able to see, without having to go to an extra app. And it's catching people that are interested in music, and then come across the podcasting choices on Spotify. And as I say, it's designed for music, but it seems to be working for podcasting.
It just does the job so well, doesn't it? And even some of the more well-known podcasters recommend Libsyn. First off, it's reliable. I don't think we've had a problem with it, have we, John? The
only problem we had was when someone put a photo in the feed.
Oh, that one. As you mentioned. And when we find out who that was,
there's going to be trouble. Yeah. There's a lot of Dan Carlin with his 6-hour episodes of Hardcore History. He hosts with Libsyn, so. And he needs a feed that works, because I think the last episode he put out had 1 million downloads in the first 24 hours. So their servers work, and we can all dream of those sorts of numbers.
Yes. Yeah.
So, it works. I believe Blueberry's reasonably good as well, just as good, but I've never had anything to do with them. So, and my other half has podcasts, was it Podbean on her Android. And that seems to work. So it may well be just as good, but that's more of a podcatcher. I believe you can host there as well, but I haven't looked into it because I use Libsyn and it's $10 US a month per show for all the stats I need. You can pay more if you want more space and more stats, but I know me, and if I could look at more stats, I would be wasting more of my time finding out who was listening in what suburbs. So enough is enough for me. It leaves me time then to go on with having fun doing those things.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the only problem I had, well, I wouldn't make a mistake like putting a photo in a shadow. I wouldn't do that. So that wasn't me, viewers. But there was one when in a month, I think I switched to a higher bitrate on MP3 to try and improve the quality. And it used up what I had, the free. I think I had to pay extra for that. So I think I asked you that, John. You said, "Well, just it's not a music show. It's a little bit more of the bit rate wouldn't make much of a difference. So to take it down, I think you said 64. Is that right?
64 is what I use. And on the feed this week, the podcast that Libsyn itself puts out every fortnight, their argument was anything above 96 or 96 kilobits per second mono, you're just wasting bandwidth because the quality is not going to change. So I picked 64 because there are people west of the ranges in Australia and, and in the wilds of Western Island, where dial-up is probably the minimum, and there are some places that are still on 2 and 3G. So I try and make it as easy for my listeners to download as possible while still maintaining an acceptable quality. And it's the balance between the two. And of course, I always do mine in mono because I only ever listen with one earbud, and I'm sure there's a lot of other people too. And that way they get the whole show, not half. But that's just a decision I made along the way. And it also keeps the file size down for people that are struggling with bandwidth. And I'm led to believe there are places in the States as well where bandwidth isn't especially wide. And so people who have got good internet connections, they're not going to notice the difference between a 64 and a 256 kilobit download. But people who have got poor connections will tell the difference. And we just try and make it as easy for people to listen as possible.
Yeah. On file sizes, there's a big thing there too. If you're storing files, you've got smaller files, so they make it a little easier.
Yep. All right. Well, I think that basically covers the mechanics of your file to your listeners' ears. Next week, I won't be here on Friday because we're off to London for the weekend. But the next episode will be on choosing a name for your show. So that'll be fun because it's the first creative step almost.
All right.
That should be fun. That'll be next Tuesday at about the same time.
All right. I might avail myself of your knowledge and webinar on Tuesday. Okay, John. Fantastic.
Any help will be useful. And with that, if you've got any more questions, just go to the website, mrjohnmoore.com. It's in the notes for this video. And this will be out as a podcast in the next couple of days as well. So people can re-listen there if they'd like. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back in a week. Bye.
Thank you, John.